The garage door was open, and that was the first wrong note in a morning that already felt slightly off, the kind of April light
that makes steam rise from a forgotten mug and dust drift in a solemn dance. I stood at the kitchen sink with coffee cooling in my hands and stared through the window at the rolled-up door and the dark mouth of the garage beyond. In all the years of our marriage, Dennis never left that door open overnight. Not once. Not in summer storms, not in winter blackouts, not in the exhausted hours after a double shift.
But Dennis was gone. 8 months now, and the open door made the absence louder than any sound could. I put the mug down, slid my feet into slippers, stepped into the soft, warm air of early spring, and crossed the lawn that needed mowing, the blades brushing my ankles while the concrete cooled the thin soles under me. The oil stain in the center of the floor was as familiar as a birthmark, the dark oval that had sat beneath the same car for 2 decades, and the way my breath caught told me what my eyes did not want to accept. The stain remained, the car did not. I stood inside the echo of where it had been and let my eyes move through the room Dennis had kept like a chapel. The tools hung on the pegboard inside their neat black outlines, his red toolbox closed and squared to the corner, the old radio with its crackle and classic rock silence now, the orange pumice soap by the sink, and his work journal lying open as if his hand had just left it. I touched the page and felt the fatigue in his handwriting from the last weeks, letters loosened, lines less crisp, and still full of him. Almost done. 2 decades on this beauty. Can't wait to teach Carol to drive her properly. Our retirement road trip starts next summer. I put the journal back exactly as I found it and stood still long enough to smell him in the room, the clean mineral tang of oil and the soft leather that warmed under his palm, and the faint trace of his aftershave that seemed to hide in wood and rags and come forward whenever I most missed him. A car turned onto Oakwood Drive and the sound folded into the quiet. My son's black sedan eased into the driveway, polished, leased, a point he made at Christmas as if the method of ownership were a badge to be shown. Brian got out, and, even at a distance, the old tells were there, the way his shoulders rolled forward when he knew he had done something he should not have, the way his hands sought his pockets, the way his eyes tried to find some corner to study that was not mine. Vanessa stepped out on the passenger side, hair glossy and straight, sunglasses large and impenetrable, her outfit cut to whisper about money. She did not come forward. She watched. Brian stopped at the line where driveway becomes breadth of house. "Mom?" I waited. He swallowed. "I need to talk to you." I asked where the car was, though I already knew. His jaw twitched, and the words dropped between us like a wrench on concrete. He had sold it. He said it quickly, as if speed could soften it, as if a clean slice hurt less than a jagged tear. He needed the money. Vanessa's business, Paris, connections, timing. He said the figure, $15,000. It arrived like a number from another language, a sound without meaning, and all I could do was fold my arms so my hands would not show their trembling. "That was your father's car," I said, and he told me his father was gone and the car was just sitting there, and the past tense hung in the air between us like smoke. Vanessa crossed the small distance then, her hand light and possessive on his forearm, her voice practiced to sound reasonable as a brochure. She told me it was done, that they left for Paris in the morning, that this was about building a life, and surely I understood. I looked at her and felt the slap of how little I knew after 2 years of marriage to my son, how her smile never reached her eyes, how she used the word "we" as a rope looped snugly around my child. She said I would love the museums and the architecture, and I watched Brian look at everything except me. They left with a promise to send photographs, as if that were comfort, and the car that was supposed to be our road into old age together was already gone to finance a snapshot of someone else's dream. When the sedan turned the corner, the quiet mutated again. I went back into the garage and stood over the stain because it was proof of a thing that had existed, and I picked up the journal and pressed it to my chest the way you hold a person who is not there. I turned off the light, locked the door, returned to the kitchen, and tried to breathe like I had taught frightened patients for 43 years. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Feel the ground. Name the room.
Choose the next gentle action.
Sleep never came. I read the same page of the journal until the letters blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again, making a little ritual of my grief over the car because it was easier than the grief for the man. At first light, the phone rang with an unknown number, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me reached for the handset. The voice on the other end was rough, the way a voice gets after a long night. Careful, the way a man speaks when he knows he might break. He asked if I was Mrs. Bennett and told me his name was Tom Graves from Graves Classic Auto, and then he said a sentence I could not make fit in my mind. He had my husband's car. I said the words back to him to make sure we were talking about the same thing, the Shelby, and he told me to please come now, please, because there was something Dennis wanted me to know, and he should have spoken at the funeral, but could not. He gave me an address, and a memory arrived of a man in a dark suit near the door of the funeral home, eyes red and gone, before condolences could turn into conversation. I dressed in jeans and a sweater and drove across town with my hands locked high on the wheel, passing the hospital where I spent my working life, and the places where Dennis and I had once built ordinary days into a marriage, trying not to look at empty passenger seats and a horizon that did not know my name. Graves Classic Auto sat at the end of an industrial street, a clean building with a glass front and a chain-link fence behind which old beauties gleamed like they had never known rain. A man with gray hair waited outside, as if he had been standing there listening for my engine. He held out a hand that felt strong, even though it trembled. He said my name, and his own, and then he told me in a quiet voice that my husband had saved his life a quarter of a century ago by co-signing a loan when no bank would hear his dream, and that a business had been born from that risk and from my husband's belief in him. He said Dennis never would have told me because that was the sort of man he was. Tom's eyes filled, and he looked toward the garage as if it could steady him. When Brian brought the car in, he said, he knew it before the paperwork opened, knew it in the way a man knows the shape of his own hand in the dark. Because Dennis had shown him photographs and progress and hope, had spoken of the car the way some men speak of a first child. My son, he said, had no idea what he was selling, no idea what it was worth. And when I asked the number, he met my eyes and told me softly that it was in the realm of $180,000, a documented 1967 Shelby GT 500, restored to museum standard by the two hands I had held for more than 4 decades. The amount meant less to me than the truth inside it, which was that years of Saturdays and patience and joy had been reduced to a quick figure for a quick trip. I sat down on the curb because my legs did not trust me, and Tom sat beside me and kept company with my shock until I could breathe without counting. He had bought the car because Brian was desperate, and because, he said, there had been a promise. 2 years earlier, Dennis had made him swear that if anything happened, he would call me and put into my hands whatever my husband had left for me inside that machine. Tom stood and offered me his hand and led me through bright service bays to where 3 covered shapes slept beneath the lights. He folded back the last canvas, and there she was, our burgundy, the chrome throwing back the room in small moons, every curve exactly as my fingers remembered. I opened the driver's door and sat, and the leather gathered me like a familiar chair, and the subtle perfume of our garage rose from the seams as if the car had carried our house within it. Tom leaned on the sill and told me that Dennis had asked him to help install a hidden compartment, not because of greed or fear, but because of love, because there was something I needed to know, and a place Vanessa would never think to look. He showed me the trick, the press and the pull that released the radio face and revealed the dark behind it. Then he stepped away and left me with the humming quiet and the square of shadow that held my future. I reached in and felt the backs of papers and the cool slide of a wooden box and the weight of a sealed envelope with my name written in my husband's hand. And for a long breath, I simply stared at the letters of Carol, as if reading them might bring him through the door. I broke the seal as carefully as I used to open medication ampules at 3 a.m, because something in me wanted the act itself to be clean. Dennis's handwriting slid toward me in the steady lines I had watched across grocery lists and birthday cards and notes taped to the coffee machine. He had dated the page 2 months before he died, and begun with my name in a way that felt like a hand cupping my cheek. If I was reading, he wrote, he was gone, and he was sorry not to have told me while he was alive,
because I would have insisted we carry it together. He needed proof. He had been watching Vanessa for 1.5 years. He had learned that her real name was not the one on her driver's license, and that she had left behind other husbands and other families with empty accounts, and sold houses and elders tucked into places they did not need because fear is a quick sales pitch. He laid out what he feared she would do to us, with a calm that made the words feel colder. She would turn Brian's love into a lever. She would make my age a story. She would build an argument that the safest thing was to take the house from beneath my feet. In the small wooden box was the key to the safe deposit box at First National, and inside that vault I would find stock certificates he had forgotten and then found again. A buried acorn that had grown into something we could live on. He told me Tom would know to call if the car was touched, that Tom was good, that I should trust him. He told me to protect myself and to protect our son, because love had made him blind and none of this was his fault. He ended with the words a wife thinks she will never be lucky enough to hear at the exact moment she most needs them. I am still protecting you. My hands shook by the end, so I let the letter lie on my lap and opened the manila folder. And the air changed the way it does when a curtain is drawn. There were photographs of Vanessa in white beside men who were not my son. Different chapels, different flowers, different cities written in neat type beneath the pictures. There were copies of marriage certificates with the same stolen name printed beside different grooms. There were news clippings about a son who convinced his mother to sell her house for an exquisite facility and then watched his new wife disappear with the proceeds. About a family business that slipped from a pair of hands that had been stained with oil for 4 decades and landed in a stranger's pocket. There were pages of Dennis's notes in the tidy print he used for measurements and instructions. Dates and times when she had asked about my health in bright, innocent tones. When she had opened a cabinet she had no reason to open. When she had looked too long at the locked drawer where the deed slept. At the back were phone numbers written as carefully as recipes, and beside each number his small, precise reminder: call. Tom returned only when he felt the room level. He brought water and silence, and then, with a steadiness that gave me some to borrow, offered his office and the privacy to make hard calls. I dialed the first number with the folder open and the letter under my palm and put the phone on speaker so Tom could be a witness to the truth. The man who answered in Phoenix sounded like someone who had rehearsed his story for years and still could not bear its middle. He said his name was Stanley, and when I told him mine and said the name of the woman attached to our pain, he exhaled like a long-held note and told me he had been waiting for this. He described a spring when grief and loneliness made him soft around the edges, and how a woman met him where his ribs were unguarded and spoke to him in the voice people reserve for the broken. He told me how she loved him with patience and competence, how she searched articles about dementia and circled phrases like risk and safety, and left those pages where he would find them, how his mother's harmless forgetfulness became evidence under the light of her concern. He explained the mathematics of fear, how $20,000 a month for the best facility sounds like devotion when you are terrified of doing the wrong thing, how a house can turn into numbers and signatures and a room with a bed that smells like antiseptic. He said his mother died asking to go home, and there was no home, and that the account was empty and the police could do nothing because the account had 2 names on it. He said to document everything, to believe nothing she said about my mind, and to stop her before paperwork made lies irreversible. I thanked him, and he said to please make it mean something. The second call went to Tampa, and a man named George, who answered on the first ring as if he kept the phone in his hand. He had met her at his father's funeral, a place where the floor tilts beneath you, and anyone with a steady gaze feels like a dock. He told me she turned grief into a shared country where 2 people could speak the same language, and that from that language she built a quick marriage and then a faster liquidation of a small, honest business that had fed a family for 40 years. Sell, she said, and begin anew. And the idea of a clean page is irresistible when you are covered in the fingerprints of sorrow. He signed, and she vanished within 3 days, a magician of withdrawals and one-way flights and names that did not belong to her. He had traced her to a different coastline and then to a different account, and the money had unraveled like a sweater tugged by an invisible hand. He asked if my son had keys to my house and access to my paper life, and when I said not yet, he said I still had time if I used it correctly. The call ended, and Tom and I sat with the weight of two strangers' grief, and I realized how clearly Dennis had seen the shape of the threat and how lonely it must have been to carry it while still being a husband and a father and a man who worked on a car one careful weekend at a time. Tom slid a card across the desk and said Dennis had asked a friend to help gather proof, a private investigator named Peter Coleman, who had promised to keep a respectful distance until his work was needed. I took the card and the folder and the letter and drove straight to the bank because my husband had asked me to, because I wanted to know if the branch of protection he had planted in a safe deposit box still had leaves. The bank manager walked me to the vault with that mix of briskness and ceremony banks use for rooms where people keep their secrets. Box 447 opened on a tidy stack of documents and a single envelope that carried my name in smaller letters, the way he wrote when he tried to fit more love into less space. The certificates were for a company with a clean, modern name I barely recognized, shares purchased for a small sum the year we were still clipping coupons and paying for cleats and clarinet reeds and dentist appointments. The manager typed and scrolled and then looked up with a softness that told me she enjoyed delivering this sort of news. The company had gone public in the last year. The shares were now worth an amount that made me sit before my knees decided for me, and when she asked if I was all right, I told her the truth. My husband had taken care of me in a way I had not known, and I was feeling the shock of being loved well past death. The next morning I met Peter Coleman at a coffee shop whose windows faced the hospital's side entrance, a place where I had eaten more muffins than I could remember between shifts and sat with families when we had run out of medical words and needed human ones. Peter was the kind of man who made you think of notebooks and file folders and quiet questions, gray at the temples, careful with the way he occupied space. And when he shook my hand, he told me he had been waiting for Dennis's signal and hoping it would never come. He opened a folder and showed me the careful trail Vanessa had left, because people as talented as she is always believe they are more clever than the world. There were posts on caregiver forums under a false name about how to persuade a reluctant elder to accept help, searches for the cost of assisted living in our state, a string of property lookups for houses in my neighborhood, and receipts attached to credit cards I did not know existed but did bear my son's name. There were dinners and hotels and clothes with price tags that could have fed a family for a month, and there was a reservation at a boutique hotel across the ocean that explained the urgency with which our car had been traded for a week of mirrors and photographs. Peter laid out a timeline with the cool efficiency of a surgeon, phase by phase, the way she would stretch concern into a case, and I recognized it immediately because I had already lived inside the early beginnings. He told me the police could not intervene until she stepped across a line in our state, and that the best chance at truth was to build a record and to let Brian find it for himself. If we confronted her with fury and accusation, she would simply wrap that fury around us and call it evidence of instability. We would need patience of the kind Dennis wrote into his notes. That evening I made a pot roast because familiar smells help the heart remember where it lives, and I invited them to dinner and told myself I could sit across from her without showing my knowledge. They arrived with skin newly burnished by another coast sun, and the weight of the trip showing in the tightness around Brian's eyes. Vanessa narrated their journey as if she were selling a city, the angle of light on old stones, and the wine in a restaurant where the tablecloths could have been cut from clouds. And then she pivoted with a dancer's grace into the assertion that the trip had shown her what they were missing and what they deserved. She looked at me when she said it, and the implication passed across the table like a chill. Gently, almost sweetly, she told me the house was too large for one person, that the stairs were not kind to women my age, that a smaller place would be a kindness to my joints and my mind. Brian nodded because she had said we, and sometimes the only thing a lonely person wants is to belong to a plural. I poured more coffee and said I was managing, and when she excused herself for the bathroom, she took a wrong turn all the way upstairs to the office that holds our papers, even though the bathroom has lived beside the kitchen since the house was built. I met her in the hallway, and she laughed in a way that asked me to be a good sport, that asked me not to make things awkward. I walked her back without comment, and after they left, I wrote down everything in a notebook because memory is a poor witness without ink. In the morning, I called Brian and asked him to come alone because I had something of his father's to show him. He arrived wary and already braced, arms crossed like a man holding himself in place, and when his eyes fell on the folder, he stiffened as if a warning siren had sounded. I asked for a few minutes of open ears and then put his father's letter into his hands and watched the blood leave his face. He tried on denial as if it were a jacket he could shrug into and out of, tried on anger as if volume could change the shapes on the page, and when that failed, he stood and paced and asked me to stop, asked me to please stop dismantling the version of love that let him sleep. I laid out the photographs and the certificates and the phone numbers and said if he wanted me to be wrong, he could make the calls and allow two strangers to tell him it was someone else. He crumpled the paper in his fist and left without saying goodbye, and I did not call after him because I knew, the way a nurse knows when the medicine has to reach the vein at its own speed. That night, just after midnight, the phone rang and my son's voice came through broken and young, the way he used to sound when a fever spiked. He had called both men. The stories matched like fingerprints. He had gone home and asked Vanessa small questions and watched her answers bend like light through water, and when he pressed about the credit cards, the mask had slipped and the contempt had shown. She had packed a bag in front of him and called him weak and left. I told him to stay put and called Peter, and he answered on the first ring, because men like Peter sleep with one ear open. He had already seen the pattern in the card withdrawals and the hotel check-in and the one-way ticket to a city south of the border in the first light of morning. He had already called detectives in the States where warrants waited for a name that was not quite hers. If Brian would meet us and make a statement, if he would sign where the law needed ink, we could stop her before she reached a gate. At 3 a.m, Peter's headlights swept across my driveway, and I opened the door before he could knock. Brian was behind him, pale and hollow-eyed, carrying nothing but a folded jacket under his arm. He looked like someone who had been dropped into a world that no longer followed the rules he knew. We sat at the kitchen table where Dennis had once taught him to balance checkbooks and change spark plugs, and Peter spread out the papers with the steady calm of a man who has done this before. The police were waiting at the airport, he said, and all we needed was Brian's statement to complete the chain. It would mean publicity and courtrooms and testimony, but it would also mean an end. Brian sat very still and asked me what his father would do, and I told him Dennis would already be in the car driving toward the airport, not because of revenge, but because of justice. My son nodded, signed where Peter pointed, and we left the house in the quiet before dawn, the streets empty except for the soft whine of tires and the distant pulse of traffic lights. The airport was still half asleep when we arrived, its halls smelling of coffee and disinfectant. We stood behind a column near the security checkpoint where Peter had arranged for us to wait. 2 detectives lingered nearby, plainclothes but unmistakable in posture and purpose. At 5:30, the line began to move, a slow river of travelers unrolling toward the gates. And then she appeared, hair perfect, coat expensive, 2 large suitcases rolling behind her like obedient pets. She moved easily, phone in one hand, ticket in the other, her expression serene. For a moment, I saw the woman my son had loved. And then I remembered the woman who had studied my stares and my deed and my life. The detective stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." She turned, confusion arranged carefully across her face. When they said her true name, Linda Marsh, her smile twitched, but she kept it, asking if there was some mistake, her voice all honey and grace. One detective showed his badge. "Please step aside." She did not. She ran. It happened fast, and yet I can still see every frame. The luggage hit the floor, one heel snapped, her body angled forward in flight. She made it less than 20 feet before airport security took her down near the departure board. There was a sound, shouting, the clatter of phones, the scrape of heels, and then the image of her pinned, hair across her face, still shouting that she had done nothing. The detectives read her rights, and one of them opened the suitcase she had dropped. Inside was a small fortune in cash, bound in neat stacks, and beneath that, a passport with her photograph but another false name, another life she had intended to wear. When she lifted her head, she saw us. For a moment she froze. Then her face changed, a ripple of pure hatred cutting through the cosmetics. "You!" she spat, lunging, the cuffs biting her wrists as the officers held her. "You pathetic old woman. You should have died and saved me the trouble." The crowd pulled back, recording on their phones. She twisted toward Brian and screamed that he was weak, that she had never loved him, that he was nothing. I stepped forward, not speaking, only standing between them the way mothers do when danger points toward their children. She kept screaming until the doors closed behind her, and then there was silence, except for the hum of the conveyor belts and the sound of my son crying quietly beside me.
2 weeks later, we gave our statements at the police station, where a detective with tired eyes told us that Linda Marsh had built a career out of deception. The real Vanessa, whose name she had stolen, had been dead for years. There were victims across states, charges waiting like storm clouds. The prosecutor expected a plea, 12 to 15 years in federal prison. Brian's forged credit cards were cleared as fraud, the debts erased, but the shame stayed in his face for a while longer. The marriage was annulled because it had never been real, not in law, not in truth. He moved back into his old room, the one still dressed in posters of football players and rock bands, and for weeks he floated between silence and apology, between exhaustion and the first flickers of healing. I didn't push. I cooked the meals he loved, kept coffee ready, left lights on. Some nights I heard him moving in the garage, standing where the car had once rested, his footsteps tracing ghosts. 2 months after the arrest, the prosecutor called to confirm the plea. 12 years. I told Brian at dinner, and he nodded, but didn't speak. The next morning, I found him in the garage, sitting on Dennis's old stool with the work journal open on his lap. He had tears on his cheeks. Not loud tears, but quiet, steady ones that carved down his face as he read his father's notes. Taught Brian to change the oil today. He's 12, old enough to learn. His hands are still small but careful. So proud of him. Brian looked up at me and shook his head. I barely remember this. He turned the page and found another entry. Brian came by to help with the engine rebuild. We worked all afternoon. Barely talked. Didn't need to. These are the days I'll remember. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I sold it, Mom. I sold the car he built with his hands for $15,000 for a vacation. I betrayed everything he loved. I put my hand on his shoulder. You didn't know. But I should have. He tried to warn me. He asked about Vanessa. We fought about her the week before he died. I told him to stop interfering, that he was just jealous. He died before I could take it back. I pulled the letter from my pocket, the one Dennis had written about proof and patience, and handed it to Brian. He read slowly, his eyes following each word like a prayer. When he reached the part where his father wrote that he loved him and understood that he was a victim too, his breath broke, and he folded forward into my arms, sobbing the way he had when he was a child with a scraped knee and no words big enough for the pain. I held him, rocking gently, and the smell of motor oil and old leather and dust surrounded us like the air inside a memory. When the tears stopped, he said he wished the car were still here so he could make it right, and I told him maybe life had one more surprise left. The surprise came 3 weeks later. A low rumble outside the house drew us both to the window, and there, shining like forgiveness, was the Shelby in the driveway, burgundy paint glowing under the noon sun. Tom Graves stepped out from behind the wheel, smiling the way a man does when he knows he's delivering a miracle. Brian's mouth fell open. Tom waved, said he was bringing her home where she belonged. I walked out first, my knees trembling. Tom, you paid for it. You can't just give it away. He shook his head. This car isn't mine. It was never anyone's but yours and Dennis's. Money can't own what love built. Brian stepped forward, his voice rough. I don't deserve this. Tom looked at him for a long time and said, Your father would disagree. He built it for his family, for you to learn from his hands, and for you to remember what kind of man you came from. He handed me the keys. Together we opened the garage door, and Tom backed the Shelby into its old place, the wheels stopping perfectly over the faded oil stain, like time closing its own loop. When the engine cut off, the silence that followed was full and right. The air smelled of motor oil and redemption. Tom stayed for coffee, telling stories about car shows and about Dennis's laugh, the kind of memories that stitch themselves into the room. When he left, Brian and I stood in the garage, the car between us gleaming softly. I can't believe it's back, he said. Neither can I answered, touching the hood where Dennis's fingerprints once lived. But it feels like he never really left.
That night, for the first time in months, Brian ate everything on his plate and laughed at one of my old stories about the hospital. The house felt different again, no longer a museum for grief, but a home with a pulse. Spring melted into summer. On a quiet Sunday morning, Brian came down with the work journal under his arm and a hesitant smile. "You ready to learn to drive it, Mom?" I nodded. We opened the garage, sunlight catching the chrome, and he read from the journal's first line. "Start with the oil. Check it first, every time." He found the dipstick, his hands steady now, his movements patient and exact. The same gestures Dennis once taught him flowed back through muscle memory, and I could see my husband in every careful motion. We spent hours working through the car, checking each system, following Dennis's instructions line by line until the day felt like it belonged to all three of us. When Brian looked up, there was a brightness in his face I hadn't seen in years. "I forgot how much I loved this," he said softly. "Being in the garage, working with my hands, hearing the engine breathe." He closed the hood with reverence. "I'm going to take care of it, Mom, the way Dad wanted." "We'll take care of it," I told him. That afternoon, I stood with the keys in my hand and felt a quiet courage I hadn't felt since before Dennis died. Brian smiled. "You're ready." I climbed into the driver's seat, the leather cool against my back, and the steering wheel warm where his hands had polished it smooth. I started the engine, and the deep growl filled the air, a living sound, part machine, part memory. I eased the car out of the garage, Brian beside me, his hand resting lightly on the dashboard. We drove down Oakwood Drive with the windows open, wind tangling our hair, the sunlight cutting through the trees. Every turn felt like a heartbeat. We passed the hospital, the high school, the quiet streets of our town, carrying the ghost of a man who had never stopped protecting us. When we pulled back into the driveway, I parked the Shelby exactly over its mark, turned off the ignition, and sat in the golden hush that followed.
"Dad would be proud," Brian said.
"Of us," I corrected. That evening, I looked out the window at the closed garage, the car resting where it belonged, Dennis's tools lined like soldiers on the wall, his journal open to the page we had followed. I thought about the letter he had written, "I'm still protecting you," and realized he was. In every plan, every precaution, every act of love disguised as foresight, he had made sure I would be safe even when he was gone. I wasn't alone, not then, not now. So that's my story. Tell me, if it were you, could you forgive your child for selling something that precious? Let me know in the comments, and remember to subscribe to the channel because our best chapters don't end when we grow older. They begin when we finally understand what love was protecting all along. Brian lingered in the garage long after sunset, the faint smell of gasoline and metal curling into the quiet. I stood in the doorway watching him trace the outlines of his father's tools with the tip of his finger. Each one hung precisely where Dennis had left it, the black silhouettes on the pegboard still crisp, as if waiting for the next project. Brian turned, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been cleaned 20 years ago, and smiled faintly. "You know," he said, "I used to think Dad cared more about this garage than about anything else. Now I get it. It wasn't about the car. It was about the time." He pulled up the stool and opened the work journal again. The pages were yellowed around the edges, fingerprints faintly smudged into the corners, the paper soft from years of being turned. "He always wrote like this," Brian murmured, tracing the looping letters with one finger. "Straight lines, no mistakes. Even his notes were patient." I nodded, remembering the same neat script on grocery lists, on birthday cards tucked under my pillow. "That was his way of fixing things twice," I said quietly. "Once with his hands, once with his words." The garage light flickered and hummed. Outside, a breeze lifted through the maple branches, scattering the smell of fresh oil and summer rain. I stepped closer and looked at the open page. June 14th. Changed spark plugs. Brian helped. Asked if engines breathe like people. Told him yes. They take in air, make power, and exhale. He laughed. Said it sounded like us. My throat tightened, but the ache was softer now, like something finally healing from the inside. We closed the journal, turned off the light, and left the car resting in its place. The night wrapped around the house with the comfort of routine. The same creak on the top stair, the same hum from the refrigerator, the same softness of shared silence. Brian slept in his old room again, the walls still carrying faint outlines of posters long taken down. In the morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the low thud of cabinet doors. My son was in the kitchen, barefoot, flipping pancakes on the stove. "Morning," he said without turning. "Thought I'd make breakfast for once." I laughed, the sound strange in my throat after so many months of holding everything in. "Your father would faint," I said. "Then ask for seconds."
The weeks that followed folded into something gentle. Brian found part-time work at a local auto shop. Just temporary, he said at first, but I saw the way his shoulders straightened when he came home smelling of oil and exhaust. He started talking about maybe taking night classes in mechanics, maybe opening a place like Tom's someday. I didn't press him. The hope in his eyes was enough. He was rebuilding in the same way Dennis had, slowly, carefully, one bolt at a time. I kept volunteering at the hospital twice a week, not in the ICU anymore, but in the visitors' wing, greeting families and offering tea, a small kindness that always felt bigger than it looked. Sometimes I'd see women my age sitting alone, staring at the floor tiles the way I once did, and I'd sit beside them, listen, and remind them that love doesn't disappear, it changes shape, that protection doesn't end with death, it just finds new ways to stay. One evening, I walked home under the soft wash of streetlights and stopped at the driveway. Through the open garage door, the Shelby gleamed under the bulb's golden circle, the paint reflecting the world as it was now, quiet, mended, still. Brian sat in the driver's seat, the radio humming low. I walked up, leaned on the doorframe, and listened. The song playing was the same one Dennis used to hum while working. "He taught you well," I said. Brian looked over his shoulder, his eyes calm. "He's still teaching me." I climbed in beside him, the seat warm, the smell familiar. "Let's drive," I said. He smiled, started the engine, and the sound rolled through the evening air, steady, deep, alive. We drove with the windows down, the sky a soft violet fading into night, the road stretching ahead like something waiting to be forgiven. The wind tangled my hair, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel old. I felt alive. As the headlights carved the road, I thought about all Dennis had done, the hidden folder, the stalks, the letters, the careful web of protection he'd spun around us. Love, it turned out, wasn't always soft. Sometimes it was meticulous, deliberate, as quiet and unyielding as a mechanic's patience. He had saved us before we even knew we needed saving. When we finally turned back onto Oakwood Drive, the air smelled of lilacs from Mrs. Jenkins's yard, and the world felt right again. We parked the Shelby, let the engine's last rumble fade, and sat in the stillness that followed. "You know, Mom," Brian said, resting his hand on the gear shift, "Dad didn't just build a car. He built a bridge between who I was and who I can still be." I smiled, resting my hand over his. "Then let's keep crossing it, one drive at a time." That night, as I closed the curtains, I looked once more toward the garage. The lights inside glowed faintly, reflecting off the car's hood like a heartbeat in the dark. For years I'd believed grief was something that ended when the tears stopped. But standing there, I understood. It doesn't end. It transforms, just like love does, until one morning you wake up, hear an engine start, and realize you've been carried safely into the next chapter. And maybe that's what Dennis wanted all along, to make sure that even when he couldn't be beside us, we'd still have something that could move us forward. The car, the letters, the lessons, they were all the same gift, just wrapped in time. So, yes, my story ended with forgiveness, because that's what love asks of us, to keep the doors open, the engine warm, and the road ahead waiting. The summer turned golden, slow and forgiving. The yard that had once looked wild and unkempt began to feel alive again. I planted marigolds along the walkway, the same flowers Dennis used to like because, he said, they looked like little suns even on gray days. Brian mowed the lawn every Saturday morning, the rhythmic hum of the mower mixing with the distant murmur of birds. Life returned not with grand gestures, but in small repetitions. The sound of dishes clinking, the scent of coffee, the echo of laughter from a house that had been silent for too long. Some evenings we ate on the porch and the air smelled of cut grass and gasoline, the same perfume that had followed Dennis through every summer of our lives. Brian would lean back in his chair and tell me stories about the auto shop, how fixing an old engine reminded him of his father's patience. I'd listen, nodding, and realize how much his voice sounded like Dennis's now, lower, steadier, filled with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally learned how to take care of what matters. It was late one night when Brian knocked on my door, holding something behind his back. "Close your eyes," he said, and I obeyed, smiling despite myself. When I opened them, he was holding Dennis's old leather keychain, the one shaped like a tiny wrench, its edges worn smooth. "Found it in the toolbox," he said softly. "Thought you should have it." I took it, the cool metal pressing into my palm, and felt a lump rise in my throat. "He used to say this little wrench kept the whole car together," I whispered. "Maybe it kept us together, too." Autumn crept in quietly after that, soft and amber. The leaves along Oakwood Drive turned the color of rusted metal and honey. The mornings grew crisp, and I began to drive the Shelby alone sometimes, short trips at first, just to the store or the edge of town. Each time I turned the key, I felt Dennis's hand on mine, steady, guiding. The car became more than a machine. It was a heartbeat, a memory set in motion, a way to talk to him without words. One afternoon, I drove to the small overlook where Dennis and I used to park when we were newly married, back when the world still felt endless and full of beginnings. The wind was cold on my cheeks, but the light was beautiful, the kind that seems to pause just for a moment before fading. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel and spoke aloud, though no one could hear. "You kept your promise, love," I said. "You protected us. You saved him." And in that instant, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt answered. When I got home, Brian was in the garage again, the radio playing an old Fleetwood Mac song. He looked up when I walked in. "Where'd you go?" "Just for a drive," I said, "to see the view your father loved." He smiled faintly, a knowing smile. Did he talk back? I laughed, a real laugh this time. In his way, he always does. That evening, I sat by the window with Dennis's journal in my lap. I turned to the last blank page and picked up a pen. The paper was thick, faintly yellowed. My handwriting looked foreign at first, hesitant, smaller than his, but it grew steadier with each line. Today, Brian and I drove together again. The car is home. The air smells of oil and rain. Dennis, you were right. Engines breathe, and so do we. After everything, we're still moving forward. I closed the book, placed it back on the workbench beside his tools, and turned off the garage light. Through the small window, I could see the Shelby's polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the street lamp outside. It looked like it was holding the light for us, guarding it, waiting for the next dawn. As I climbed the steps to the house, I realized something simple but profound. Grief doesn't fade, it evolves. It becomes the thread that ties the past to the present, the reason we keep going, the whisper that reminds us to live fully. Dennis had built a car, yes, but he had also built a legacy of love, of trust, of protection that outlasts the body. And now, every time the garage door rises and sunlight pours across that smooth burgundy paint, I remember what he taught me in ways he never had to say out loud. Love, real love, doesn't vanish when life ends. It shifts gears, keeps running, and waits patiently for you to catch up. Winter arrived softly that year, settling over Oakwood Drive like a gentle hush. The trees shed their last leaves, and frost silvered the edges of our windows in delicate lace. Inside, the house was warm again. Not from the heater or the old fireplace, but from the sound of life filling every corner. The ticking clock in the kitchen, Brian humming to himself while fixing a cabinet door, the faint purr of the Shelby when he started it once a week to keep her heart beating. The holidays came and went with quiet grace. No grand decorations, no extravagant gifts. Just a wreath on the door and 2 plates at the table, the way it had begun long ago. On Christmas Eve, Brian and I lit a single candle beside Dennis's photograph on the mantel. The picture showed him leaning against the Shelby, sleeves rolled up, smiling at something just out of frame. The flame flickered against the glass, and for a moment the light looked alive in his eyes. Later that night, as snow began to fall, Brian handed me a small box. Inside was a silver key fob engraved with the words, "Still protecting you." My breath caught, the world going quiet except for the soft sound of snow against the windows. "I had it made," Brian said, his voice unsteady. "For you. For him. For everything he did." I reached across the table and took his hand. "He'd be proud of you," I whispered. "He already is." In January, we started a ritual. Every Sunday morning, we'd take the Shelby out for a drive. Not far, just through the quiet back roads that wound around the lake. We didn't need to speak much. The car did the talking, the low hum of the engine filling the spaces where grief used to live. Sometimes we'd stop and watch the water, still and silver beneath the winter sky. Other times we'd just keep going, the tires drawing invisible circles around all that had been lost and found. One of those mornings, I caught Brian looking at me in the side mirror. "What?" I asked, smiling. He hesitated. "I was just thinking, I never really understood Dad's kind of love before, the kind that builds things instead of saying things." He looked away, blinking hard. "Now I do." I nodded, the wind tugging at my scarf. "That's how you know you've grown up, sweetheart, when you stop hearing love and start seeing it." Spring returned, bright and green, as if the world wanted to start over with us. The marigolds bloomed again, golden as the year before. The garage became our sanctuary, not a museum of loss, but a place of learning and rebuilding. Brian began teaching neighborhood kids how to change oil, fix small engines, understand the beauty of patience. He'd hand them Dennis's journal like it was scripture, each page a lesson about care and attention. Sometimes I'd stand at the doorway and watch, my heart full of pride so sharp it almost hurt. Then one evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to take one last drive before dinner. Brian tossed me the keys with a grin. "Don't go racing the kids on Oakwood again," he teased, and I laughed. The road stretched before me, gold and endless. The same road Dennis and I had dreamed of traveling on our retirement trip. I rolled the windows down, let the wind carry the smell of lilacs and distant rain, and felt the deep, steady pulse of the engine beneath me. The Shelby glided forward, smooth, confident, alive. And in that sound, I heard everything Dennis had ever meant to say. At a red light, I touched the small silver fob hanging from the key ring. "Still protecting you." The words gleamed softly in the last light of day. And in that moment, I realized he always would. Through the car, through Brian, through the life he'd built so carefully that even death couldn't dismantle it. When I pulled back into the driveway, Brian was waiting on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands, steam curling into the twilight. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and the sudden quiet felt full, not empty. He smiled. "Good drive?" I nodded. "The best one yet." We stood there together, watching the sky fade from gold to blue, the world exhaling around us. Inside the garage, the Shelby caught the last of the sunlight, the paint glowing like warm blood beneath skin. The house behind us was steady, lived in, whole again. I took a slow breath, feeling the air move through me, steady, calm, alive, and finally understood what Dennis had been teaching us all along. Love is not something you lose. It's something you learn how to carry. So that's my story. And if you've listened all the way through, tell me, have you ever lost something that turned out to save you in the end? Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because maybe, just maybe, our best chapters don't start when everything is perfect. They begin the moment we realize that what's gone has been guiding us all along.